بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the compassionate, the merciful. We ask that He send peace and blessings upon our noble and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He purifies our intentions and our hearts through His gentleness, His generosity, His mercy and His ease, and that He meld our intentions with the intentions of our pious predecessors, particularly with the intentions of our noble and our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan for joining us for another session of 40 Hadith on the merits of Ramadan, its fast, and other voluntary fasts throughout the year. So we're going to begin our session as we do every day by covering some of the important points from last session. If you recall, in our last session we covered two hadith. The topics were a little bit different than one another. The first hadith had to do again with this theme of Ramadan and charity. The importance of charity, the importance of giving during this month, particularly giving so that other people can break their fast based upon your giving. And that the Prophet ﷺ informed us in that narration that the one who aids the other in breaking their fast, the one who feeds them, the one who provides financial support in order for them to eat, then they receive the reward of the one breaking their fast. And in some narrations, clarifying that the one breaking their fast does not lose any reward themselves. The second hadith that we covered had to do with the intention of the fast and the centrality of the intention to the fast, and that the intention to fast is either a condition or an integral of the fast, meaning that if you don't intend, then you don't. It's not a valid performance of that obligation. Today, inshallah, we're going to move on to two new hadith, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which will take us right up to the middle point of this collection of 40 hadith. The first hadith, hadith number 20, is on the authority of Mu'adh ibn Zahra, who said that the Messenger of Allah, Allah bless him and give him peace, whenever he broke his fast, he would say, "O Allah, for you I have fasted, and upon your provision I broke my fast." And then the compiler notes, this is narrated by Abu Dawood with a mursal report. Before we kind of jump into the meanings of the hadith, this is a famous dua that many of us recite when we break our fast, just like the other one that we covered earlier in the course. This one is also one of the ones that many people have memorized and they recite. Allahumma laka sumtu wa ala rizqika aftartu. Right? And then many will continue what we learned before. ذهب الظمأ وابتلت العروق وثبت الأجر إن شاء الله. Right? But this one deals with just the first portion of that dua that many of us have memorized. Allahumma laka sumtu wa ala rizqika aftartu. Right? So just an introductory explanation of the meanings of the hadith. First thing we want to point out is the grammatical structure of the hadith, which is important. The structure is ordered in a way to really highlight that this is done for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only. So what is said, even in translation, "For you I fasted," or "For you I have fasted, and upon your provision I broke my fast." As opposed to what? As opposed to saying, for example, "I fasted for you." So "for you I fasted," as opposed to "I fasted for you." And what was said in the hadith was, "And upon your provision I broke my fast." It could have been said, "I broke my fast on your provision." In Arabic, structuring the sentence in that way is a rhetorical device to highlight what was brought forward. So, "For you I have fasted," rather than moving that "you" to the end of the sentence where it would generally be, "I fasted for you." By bringing it forward, "For you I fasted," it's emphasizing that it's only for you, right? Just like in Surah Al-Fatiha, if any of you have kind of covered the meanings of Surah Al-Fatiha, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You are the one that we worship, right? And upon you we rely, right? As opposed to flipping it the other way around. So that's the first thing. There's a highlighting in this dua that it's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the food that we're eating is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's food. It's His provision. Again, this isn't for anyone else, and this provision we have is not from anyone else. And so it's appropriate for me to intend this only for your sake. Okay? That's a rough translation of the meanings and some of the associated meanings with the hadith. Where is this hadith found? It's found in Abu Dawood, as was mentioned, An-Nasa'i, Daraqutni, and Tabarani. Some important points of the hadith. First of all, as the compiler mentioned, it's mursal. What is a mursal hadith? A mursal hadith is one where at the end of the chain, right before the person says the Prophet ﷺ said this or the Prophet ﷺ did that, the last person in that chain, at the very top, they will not narrate the hadith through a companion. It'll be someone below the companion generation, someone who came after the companions, and they'll say the Prophet ﷺ said or did this. That type of hadith is called a mursal hadith, roughly, right? It's more technical than that, but that's a rough understanding of what's happening. So somebody who's not a companion, right below them, is saying the Prophet ﷺ said or did this. So there's somebody missing, but the person missing, we don't know, is it a companion or is it not a companion, right? So that's generally called a mursal report, as was mentioned by the compiler himself, and is actually very famous in this hadith. Now, this hadith, so this hadith that we're talking about, there are other versions of it, right? The text, there are other versions, both of the text, meaning the text shifts, but also of the same text through other companions, meaning that in those versions, a companion is mentioned, right? It's not Mu'adh, right? The tabi'i, right? Rather, it's a companion that's mentioned. For example, in some of the narration, Ibn Abbas is mentioned, right, as the Sahabi who narrates the hadith. That's found in Tabarani's Kabir, and then also in Daraqutni. Sayyidina Anas is mentioned in Tabarani's Awsat and his Saghir, that he's the one who narrated the hadith. So we see that this hadith is narrated elsewhere. Now, the issue is that those other narrations that I just mentioned, they are all extremely weak, right? In fact, in their chain is someone who's been accused of something more egregious, and so we can't really rely on them at all, okay? So we're still left with this mursal hadith. Is a mursal hadith a problem? Well, on the kind of outward, very shallow understanding of hadith, yes, it's someone missing in the chain, therefore it's weak. Anyone missing from the chain makes the hadith weak. It renders it at least weak, right? Doesn't mean it's not usable, but it's weak. The thing is, though, mursal hadith specifically, if the one missing in the chain is from that generation, meaning a tabi'i saying the Prophet ﷺ said that, so the person who's missing is either a companion or not a companion, we're not sure. Yes, hadith scholars generally as a rule would call that weak. However, the ulama of fiqh, for example, had a more, they didn't have the same exact position. So the ulama of fiqh would use hadith like this, depending on the school, either much more freely or with certain conditions. So even the Shafi'is, who are often seen, rightly or wrongly, as being the most strict on this issue from the fuqaha, they use this hadith. In fact, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, who's one of the most important Shafi'i scholars, says about this hadith that this hadith is mursal, right? However, we accept it because in contexts like this, it is acceptable, and about subjects like this, which is a litany that one says when they break for fast, it's acceptable. And he mentions this specifically. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon his soul. So, and then beyond that, if we leave aside the mursal, the rest of the hadith, many have noted from the hadith scholars that it's hasan. So really the issue is that missing person right between the Prophet ﷺ, whoever it is, between the Prophet ﷺ, one person or more, between the Prophet ﷺ and that tabi'i, right? So that's, I think, a good summary of the hadith and it's where it's found. The one last thing I'll note is what I just noted there at the end, the difference between the hadith scholars and fiqh scholars is important. Hadith as a field, there's a lot of overlap between it and fiqh, right? And fiqh's relationship to hadith. But there are some questions, they're unique, that they don't necessarily have the same ruling. So that's important to note about hadith, that its relationship with fiqh, if we can maybe say as a first step, is more complex than at what it would seem at face value. So one needs to keep in mind when they're studying hadith, there's one thing for hadith scholars who are experts in hadith to say something. Sometimes the fiqh scholars will have a different opinion. is there a right and wrong? Who's right and wrong? That's for another conversation. But I think it's important to see that depth and that complexity about hadith, that both of them are studying for different purposes. One studying for should we act or not, primarily, and the other one studying primarily for did the Prophet ﷺ say it or did he not say it. Okay, the next hadith, hadith number 21. It's on the authority of Sayyidina Abu Hurairah, Allah be well pleased with him, who said that the Messenger of Allah, Allah bless him and give him peace, said, whoever does not quit false speech, or you could say whoever does not quit lying or lies, and acting on said false speech or lies, in it, Allah does not have a need for their leaving of food and drink, or does not have a need in their leaving of food and their drink, narrated by Al-Bukhari. That's what the compiler mentions. So kind of an introductory understanding of the hadith. We can kind of treat this hadith in maybe 2 or 3 distinct ways. So I'm going to kind of separate them because I think they all bring important points to the table. First, this hadith is obviously talking about fasting. Whoever does not leave in it, meaning does not leave lying in it, meaning the month of Ramadan. Okay? Or fasting, really, more specifically, not just the month of Ramadan. So the hadith is saying whoever doesn't leave lying and acting upon that lying within the fast or within the month of Ramadan, during their fast, Allah is not in need of their hunger and their thirst. Okay? The point of the hadith is not do not fast then. Okay, if you're going to lie, then don't fast. That's not the point of the hadith. Rather, it's encouraging us to fast without lying, to avoid false speech. It's encouraging us to protect our tongues in general, not just from lies. Many of the ulama, based on the differences in the wording of the hadith, expanded it beyond just lying, right? Because there's some differences in the wording, that the intent is not just lying, but the intent is to guard and to preserve one's tongue, to preserve one's speech in general. It also, the other thing that they point out related to that is that those things that we just mentioned, they're sins anyway. But during Ramadan, it's like, or during the fast, it's like you're multiplying the severity of what you're doing. So not only are you doing something haram, you're doing it within this holy month. And that's an axiom in the religion anyway, that if you do bad in holy times or in holy places, it's even more, it's more egregious, right? And there might be more sin based upon that, depending on the context and the situation. And that the good of fasting does not outweigh the evil. So that's another point. That, okay, you're doing a good, but you're lying or you're engaging in false speech, etc. So your good doesn't outweigh the negative. You still gotta avoid that negative. Finally, in this first part that we're covering, one of the things that the ulama extract from this is that what this means is that, okay, your fast is accepted because you avoided, for example, food and drink and intimacy during the day, but you don't get any reward for it. In other words, it accepted, you fulfilled your obligation, but to do all this haram in it, there's no point, and you're not receiving reward. Not no point as in it doesn't count. What it means is you didn't get the good out of it. You fulfilled your obligation, that's it, you don't get any reward, right? That's what some of the ulama mentioned. So that's one way to approach the hadith. From another angle I want to approach it is Imam al-Baydawi and others say that, look, the goal of fasting is not hunger and thirst. Rather, it's the breaking of the desires, as we've mentioned before, and to get the ego or the soul or whatever you want to kind of reference it out in this context, to follow the right path and to become tranquil. You want to get it so that it's doing the right thing and it's tranquil with the right thing. It wants to do the right thing. It wants to attach itself to that which is right. If that doesn't happen, then what's the point? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to, as we can say, gaze upon that action with the gaze of acceptance. So, what Imam Baydawi and others are saying here is, look, the fast is meant to have us reach a certain state and condition. It's not just about the food and the drink. So if we're not going to have us reach that condition, rather we're going to not eat and drink, but we're still going to do these horrible things that our soul and ego might call us to, then there's really no point. Rather, if we fulfill it and we do the right thing, we're perfecting the fast. Meaning that before that, the fast was imperfect, and then, with avoiding those things, the fast becomes more complete or more perfect. We don't want to leave the fast incomplete, right? And here we mean complete in terms of its goal, its intent, its reward, not in terms of its validity. It's valid, right? But it's without real meaning. The third and final way that I want to approach the hadith is I want to approach it from another way. We want to relate it, as some of the ulama did, to one of the earlier hadiths that we took. We took the hadith that fasting is for me, the hadith Qudsi, and I will reward for it, right? Something in fasting is unique to Allah, and He will reward for it, right? It belongs to Allah, and He will reward for it. So some of the ulama said, look, first of all, Allah doesn't need anything from us, right? But here it's like the two hadiths are playing off of one another. Fasting is for me and I will reward for it. And in this hadith, if this is what your fast is going to be like, I have no need for it, right? He doesn't have any need for it for anything, right? But it's the two hadiths are like metaphorically interfacing with one another. If you do the fast the right way, it gets this unique, lofty status of being for Allah, right? No ostentation or little to no ostentation. Done sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It really impacts the soul in a strong way. Things that you don't do, people can't see. But if you're going to just continue acting ignorantly, as some versions of the hadith indicate, to act with ignorance, then Allah is not in need of that. It removed it from that unique quality of it, right? You've removed kind of the goal of it. So yes, Allah doesn't need anyone or anything, but this is a way of highlighting the severity of it and removing it from its special status. Allah He didn't call for this. This is not the type of fast He legislated. This is not the type of fast He wants for us. And He won't accept a fast like this. So the final thing that we'll say is some of the ulama said, look, the goal of fasting is to avoid all transgressions. It's not just avoiding food and food and drink and intimacy during the day, but it's also to avoid other things, right? It's an act of avoiding and not engaging in things that Allah has made prohibited. And during Ramadan, during the day, or during the fasting day, during Ramadan specifically during the day, He's prohibited food, drink, and intimacy. But He's prohibited those other things like lying at all times. So for you to not eat or drink for us to not eat or drink during the month of Ramadan, which is a good, but then to engage in things He's always prohibited is kind of, it's a severe inconsistency, right? It's a severe inconsistency. So where is this hadith found? It's found in Al-Bukhari, as the compiler mentioned. And the author, the compiler, Imam Bukhari, actually titles the section alluding to it. Sayyidina Ahmad, Imam Ahmad's book, Al-Musnad, it's found in it. And it uses the word jahl, right? The ignorance, as opposed to just lies. Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, Ibn Khuzaymah, Ibn Hibban, all narrate the hadith. So the hadith is very strong. It's an authentic hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And I'll kind of end on this point. Imam al-Ghazali brings up something that I think is essential, which is, he says in his Ihya, he says, someone could say, wait, are you telling me that if I do these, if I don't eat and I don't drink and I don't engage in intimacy, that my fast will still not count if I, for example, say bad things or look at bad things? He says to them, no, look, I'm not telling you that your fast is not valid. Your fast is valid, as I said a few moments ago. However, your concentration only on the legal aspects and your ignoring of these ethical principles is a grave mistake. Because the legal things are important. And this is Ghazali speaking. I mean, he's an enormous figure in the Shafi'i school. So he's an enormous legal scholar. And he's an enormous legal theorist as well, in jurisprudence, etc., and theologian. He was an expert in many fields. So this is not coming from someone who doesn't think highly of the law. Rather, what he's saying is like, look, if we looked at the number of pieces of evidence for any legal injunction, they're few. For example, we looked at the one last session about the intention, right? They're there, but they're few. What are the number of hadith that talk about things like this, like not corrupting something with lying, not engaging these ethical components? They're way more in number in the Quran and hadith, way, way more, right? So he says, you're focusing on these few hadith, which is important, and he doesn't think that we shouldn't focus on them, but you're ignoring of the larger corpus of revelation. Shows kind of a misunderstanding of the point of revelation and the goals of revelation, right? And I think that's an important point. We really want to focus on that Ramadan is beyond just the kind of outward aspect. There's a real internal aspect that we also need to give its due. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He fulfills for us that, and He makes us true people of fasting, true people of leaving transgression, that we come closer towards Him, towards His noble and His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He teaches of our religion that which benefits us. He push away from us any knowledge that doesn't benefit us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept from us our fast, our recitation of Quran, our standing in prayer. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us preserve and guard our tongues, preserve and guard our bodies in a manner that's pleasing to Him. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallam ajma'een.